A few months ago, I was walking through a parking lot in Central Texas when I noticed a hedge that had been trimmed into perfect rectangles along the entire length of the building. The shrubs were dense, evergreen, with small dark green leaves and clusters of bright red berries. I had walked past this exact landscaping a dozen times. What stopped me this time was something I had read the week before. The plant in those hedges, the one I had assumed was just decorative landscaping shrubbery, was the only caffeinated plant native to North America. Its leaves contain roughly the same caffeine content as green tea, along with theobromine, the compound that gives dark chocolate. Its mood-lifting effect, and theophylline, the compound that opens airways and was historically used in asthma medication. Indigenous communities across the American Southeast had been brewing this plant into a daily caffeinated beverage for at least 1,000 years before European colonists arrived. The Spanish documented Native Americans drinking it in 1542. By 1615, Spanish priests in Florida were writing that there was no Spaniard or Indian who did not drink it every day in the morning or evening. 200 years later, the plant had been almost completely erased from American consumer awareness, not because it stopped working, but because someone with significant economic interest in the global tea trade gave it a botanical name designed to make you not want to drink it. The plant is Yaupon holly. The story of how it disappeared is one of the cleanest examples in American agricultural history of how a botanical name can function as economic warfare. If you are new here, subscribe. The plant we are talking about is Ilex vomitoria, known commonly as Yaupon holly, Yaupon tea, cassina, or in older colonial documents, Indian tea, Carolina tea, or Appalachian tea. It is an evergreen shrub or small tree native to the southeastern United States, ranging from southern Virginia down through Florida and west across the Gulf Coast into Texas. Botanically, it is a member of the holly family, Acifoliaceae, and a close cousin of the South American plant Ilex paraguariensis, which is the source of yerba mate, the caffeinated beverage consumed by millions of people daily across Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil. In a side-by-side biochemical comparison, Yaupon and yerba mate are remarkably similar. Both contain caffeine in the range of 0.7% of leaf dry weight, slightly less than coffee at 1.1%, but in the same general range as commercial green tea. Both contain the albromine, the methylxanthine that produces sustained mood elevation without the jittery rapid spike of pure caffeine. Both contain theophylline, the bronchodilator compound, used historically in respiratory medication. Both contain a substantial profile of polyphenol antioxidants, chlorogenic acids, rutin, quercetin, in concentrations that compare favorably with green tea. A 2009 study by Matthew Palumbo and colleagues at the University of Florida, published in the journal Economic Botany, documented the antioxidant capacity of Yaupon leaves in standardized laboratory testing. The results placed Yaupon in the same general range as several commercial teas and substantially higher than coffee on most antioxidant measurements. A 2011 study by Norado and colleagues documented anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects of Yaupon polyphenol extracts on human colon cell cultures. A 2025 study, published as a preprint on bioRxiv, mapped the full metabolome of Yaupon leaves across leaf, stage, and roasting conditions, identifying over 100 bioactive compounds that change concentration during processing. The science establishes a clear picture. Yaupon is not a marginal substitute for traditional caffeinated beverages. It is a botanically related, nutritionally comparable, chemically rich infusion plant that happens to grow wild across the American Southeast. Subscribe if you want more of these stories. The history is older than most Americans realize. Archaeological evidence from Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian indigenous city in what is now the United States, located across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, includes distinctive small ceramic beakers dated between 1050 and 1250 CE. Chemical residue analysis of those beakers, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, identified molecular biomarkers consistent with Yaupon tea consumption. This places organized Yaupon tea ceremony in the heart of pre-Columbian North America, roughly 400 years before any European arrived on the continent. By the time Spanish explorers reached Florida in the 1530s, Yaupon tea was already a daily beverage and ceremonial drink across most indigenous communities of the Southeast, the Timucua of Florida, the Muskogee Creek of Alabama and Georgia, the Cherokee of the Appalachian Highlands, the Catawba of the Carolinas, the Choctaw and Yuchi of the Gulf Coast. The Spanish explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca documented the beverage in his 1542 account, La Relación, describing native communities consuming what he called the black drink during ceremonial gatherings. The detail Cabeza de Vaca recorded, that participants would consume large volumes of the beverage and then sometimes vomit during the ceremony, became the basis for one of the most consequential botanical naming decisions in American agricultural history. But the vomiting, modern ethnobotanical scholars now agree, was almost certainly not caused by the plant. The black drink ceremonies involved consuming several quarts of the beverage while fasting in ritually significant social and emotional contexts. Vomiting under those conditions is consistent with volume and circumstance, not with any inherent emetic property of the leaves themselves. Modern Yaupon tea, prepared and consumed normally, does not cause vomiting. People drink it daily across multiple regions today without any digestive disturbance. The original Spanish observation was accurate. The botanical interpretation that followed was not. The transformation of Yaupon from valued beverage plant to forgotten landscaping shrub happened in a fairly compressed window of historical time, and the central event was a botanical naming decision made in 1789 in a royal garden outside London. By the late 18th century, Yaupontia had developed a substantial European market. Spanish colonists in Florida had been exporting cassina to Europe since the 1600s. By the mid-1700s, Yaupon was being shipped to France, Spain, and parts of Britain as a cheaper alternative to imported Asian tea. Unlike Asian tea, which had to be transported from China and India by ship through the controlled monopoly of the British East India Company, Yaupon grew abundantly across the southeastern American colonies. It could be harvested, dried, and shipped to Europe at a fraction of the cost of comparable Asian tea. For the British East India Company, Yaupon presented a serious commercial threat. The company's tea monopoly was the financial backbone of the British colonial economy. Tea revenues funded ships, infrastructure, and military operations across the empire. A competing caffeinated beverage that grew freely in colonial American territory and could be sold to European consumers at lower prices threatened the entire profit structure of the company's most lucrative trade. In 1789, an English botanist named William Ayton, the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and a personal friend of King George III, formally renamed the Yaupon holly. He gave it the Latin species name vomitoria, which translates roughly as to cause vomiting. The naming was technically based on Cabeza de Vaca's 1542 description of the black drink ceremony. It was botanically misleading even in 1789. Yaupon does not cause vomiting under normal consumption, and Ayton would have had access to multiple sources documenting daily Spanish and colonial consumption without any such effect. But the name stuck. For the next 200 years, Ilex vomitoria sat in botanical literature under a Latin label that explicitly framed the plant as something that would make you sick. The commercial effect was immediate. European consumers who had been buying Yaupon as a tea substitute now hesitated when they saw it labeled as the vomiting holly. By the early 19th century, European Yaupon imports had declined substantially. The British tea monopoly was preserved. Asian tea continued to dominate the European caffeinated beverage market through the entire colonial period and into the 20th century. What is unusual is what happened to Yaupon in its own native range. Across the American Southeast, Yaupon tea continued to be consumed by indigenous communities, by enslaved African Americans on southern plantations who had adopted the beverage from native and colonial sources, and by poor white settlers in rural areas who could not afford imported Asian tea. By the late 19th century, Yaupon had developed a distinct social classification, the tea of the rural poor. That association, combined with the botanical name, combined with the violent disruption of indigenous communities through forced removal in the 1830s, combined with the social reorganization of the South following the Civil War, pushed Yaupon almost entirely out of mainstream American beverage culture. By 1900, most American grocery stores sold imported Asian tea, coffee, and increasingly cocoa. Yaupon was effectively absent from commercial markets. The plant continued growing wild across its native range. Nothing about its biology had changed, but the cultural and economic infrastructure for its consumption had been dismantled in a process that took roughly 150 years and produced exactly the result the British tea monopoly would have preferred. Mark Williams, an ethnobotanist who has spent over a decade researching Yaupon's history, has stated in published interviews that the deliberate suppression of Yaupon is one of the cleanest examples in American history of botanical economics, shaping consumer behavior through naming and association rather than through any change in the plant itself. The plant was suppressed. It was not eliminated. It was waiting. Around 2010, a small number of entrepreneurs in Florida, Texas, and the Gulf Coast began commercially harvesting and marketing Yaupon tea under that traditional name. Companies like Lost Pines Yaupon in Texas, Yaupon Brothers in Florida, and several smaller producers have built a small but growing industry around exactly the same plant that William Ayton tried to bury 235 years ago. Yaupon is now available in specialty grocery stores, online retailers, and an increasing number of cafes across the American South. The 2025 BioWahrungsVi preprint study mentioned earlier specifically framed Yaupon as a sustainable alternative caffeinated beverage suited for cultivation in environmental conditions where coffee and Asian tea cannot grow. The plant is having its second moment. The practical question for someone watching this video is whether Yaupon is something you can actually use today. The answer depends on where you live. Yaupon's native range covers the southeastern United States, roughly from coastal Virginia down through Florida and west, along the Gulf Coast into central Texas. Within that range, Yaupon is extraordinarily common. It grows wild in coastal scrublands, sandy soil edges, river bottom lands, and across thousands of suburban yards where it has been, planted as ornamental hedging without anyone realizing the cultural significance of the species. Identification is straightforward. Yaupon is an evergreen shrub or small tree, typically growing 6 to 15 feet tall in cultivated settings. The leaves are small, about an inch long, oval-shaped with shallowly serrated edges and a glossy dark green appearance. The leaves are notably smaller and less spiky than common holiday holly leaves. In autumn and winter, female plants produce abundant clusters of small, bright red berries. The berries themselves are mildly toxic to humans and should not be eaten. The leaves are the food and tea source. For harvest, collect young leaves and small twig tips from new growth in spring or summer. Wash thoroughly. Spread on a tray and air dry for several days, or oven dry at low heat for 2 hours. For the traditional roasted preparation, which produces a deeper, fuller-bodied tea similar to yerba mate, roast dried leaves at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 to 40 minutes, turning every 10 minutes until they turn dark brown without burning. Steep 1 to 2 teaspoons of dried roasted leaves in a cup of just boiled water for 4 to 6 minutes. The flavor is earthy, slightly nutty, with notes of yerba mate and dark green tea. Unlike Asian tea, Yaupon contains no tannins. This means the tea cannot become bitter from oversteeping. It also will not stain teeth. It will not interfere with iron absorption from food. For a healthy adult, 1 to 3 cups daily provides a moderate caffeine intake comparable to weak coffee or strong black tea. 2 important practical cautions. First, never harvest from chemically treated landscaping. Yaupon is widely planted as ornamental hedging, and many commercial properties spray it with pesticides and herbicides. Harvest only from your own untreated yard, from neighbors who grant permission and confirm no chemical treatment, or from wild populations in clean, natural areas. Second, the small red berries are mildly toxic to humans. They are not life-threatening, but can cause nausea and digestive upset. Use the leaves only. Berries should be left for birds, which can metabolize them safely. For purchase rather than harvest, Yaupon tea is now available from a small but growing number of producers. The tea typically costs between $15 and $30 per pound of dried leaves, expensive compared to commodity Asian tea, but reasonable for a heritage native botanical that supports small producers in regions where the plant has cultural significance. What you have when you brew Yaupon tea is the beverage that pre-Columbian civilizations consumed at Cahokia, that cabeza de vaca documented in 1542, that European royalty briefly imported in the 1700s, that William Ayton attempted to suppress through botanical naming in 1789, and that small American producers are now reintroducing to a country that almost forgot the only caffeinated plant native to its own continent. If you live anywhere in the American Southeast, Yaupon is almost certainly growing within walking distance of where you're watching this video. Look for a small evergreen shrub with shallowly serrated dark green leaves, clusters of bright red berries in autumn tours, and dense dark foliage year-round. Next week, a tree native to the eastern United States that produces a fruit 4 times the size of a peach with more vitamin C than orange juice. Overlooked because the fruit must be processed correctly to be edible. Subscribe if you want the rest.